We're all the way back. It's Poor Sports Seattle, and big Friday episode, pre-recorded, just so you know. So don't send in your chats, whatever. But I'm not gonna see them. I'm as you listen to this, I'm probably picking my kids up, and then I'm going out with some buddies. Not even out. Going to a buddy's house, cracking some crazy bottles of whiskey, having a good Friday night. I'm not available a lot of Friday nights, so taking advantage of it, going to hang out with a couple buddies of mine, drink some whiskey. So this is a pre-recorded episode, but I wanted to talk about a couple things before the week ended. First off, I'm going to talk about who I think the Seahawks should hire as their offensive coordinator. And I just wanted to say, this is like not an idea that is going to be unique to me. There's going to be plenty of other people putting out content on this. And I know I haven't watched it yet because I'm terrified of plagiarizing or copying him. But Dan Viens, who's been on this podcast before and who I think does a really good job, already did this at Seahawks Forever. Did this. I will watch it after I record it because I think Dan's great. And I do try to limit before I do the podcast. I try to limit what I consume so I don't let it bleed into my brain and take other people's opinions as mine. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some stuff that I've heard recently. That's I'm like, oh, well, this is something that I've already talked about. Not that anyone's taken from me, by the way. Absolutely not. I don't believe that. But it's just there's only so many takes you can have, right? So go check out Dan Viens at Seahawks Forever. And he actually has a new podcast that he's starting with, I can't think of his name, but they're doing a Bryce Coote. Anyways, they do some stuff together on Dan's podcast and on Bryce's Seahawks podcast. Also, it's a draft podcast. If you like draft stuff, I love draft stuff. Go check that out also. Anyway, we're going to talk about who I think the Seahawks should hire as their offensive coordinator. We're going to talk about also who you should be rooting for as a Seahawks fan in the playoffs as we enter the NFL playoffs and the Seahawks are not in the playoffs. But the one thing I wanted to talk about, and we're not going to talk about the Mariners in depth today because I guess just because it's depressing that they've done nothing. I have some opinions on that. We'll get into them next week. But I've been listening to local sports radio a little bit lately. And I've found, by the way, there's one station in particular, and I don't think this is I don't know what ratings are like. I actually don't really care that much about I'll tell you my decision-making process on listening to 710 ESPN Seattle, which is not, I'm not telling you that you're going to know from my decision-making process that I'm not making a quality judgment on KJRAM or whatever it is now, 93.3, whatever they were. It's hard for me to move past the names that they were when I was a kid because I grew up listening to sports radio. I was listening to sports radio before ESPN Seattle existed or whatever it's called now, Seattle Sports. I even remember it when it was by its previous name. The decision-making process for me was ESPN Seattle or Seattle Sports. That's a cheating name, by the way. They post the live stream of their radio shows on YouTube. So a couple things are beneficial about that. One, I have YouTube Premium. I can play it with my phone off or on a different window very easily. And so for me, there's no I have to keep my phone open or anything like that. There's no phone inconvenience. It's the same as listening to a podcast or any other live stream. Also, frankly, and this is going to sound weird, podcast or internet broadcasts sound better than over-the-air broadcasts. The sound quality is significantly better going over Bluetooth and YouTube than it is going over your radio. And one other thing, and don't make this a thing that makes you guys fast forward or not allow me to fast forward, but you can fast forward through the ads. And now, I don't think that's a big integrity hit compared to the radio because on the radio, what I know a lot of people do is they will not necessarily fast forward through the ads, but they'll switch to another station when when the ads are playing. So I hear some of the ads on accident. Don't get mad, advertisers of 710 ESPN. The reason I've been listening to sports radio, though, is the same problem I had taking my kids to daycare. You start listening to podcasts, you listen to a comedy podcast, you listen to even a news podcast, and it's just like not appropriate. They're swearing. I was listening to some news podcasts, and my daughter starts asking questions about the presidential election a couple months ago, and I'm like, it's not really that I think that's completely inappropriate or that I refuse to talk to my kids about it. I grew up in a family, by the way, where we did not talk about politics at all. And I think that kind of sucks. Part of the reason is my parents disagreed on politics, and so they didn't want to start an argument at the table. But the rule of my house was like, you never ask anyone who they voted for, and we just don't talk about any of that stuff ever. And so it did a couple things. One, no one ever told me how to feel. No one ever told me what opinion to have or what was good, what was bad. It also made me scared to talk about that stuff to a degree. My daughter started asking questions as we were listening to stuff, and they would talk about the two presidential candidates. And I tried to answer in a way that was that I would be happy about in 5 years also. So I'm not going to tell my daughter just like we're not going to talk about it, but I answered in a way that because my opinion, by the way, is that neither candidate was any good and that none of these people are any good. That's my opinion. And I don't know how to tell my daughter that without turning into her into a cynical asshole. So I started listening to sports radio. My only advice to you, this is my advice to you, listen to it on YouTube, get YouTube Premium, and then you can listen to this, by the way. You can listen to our live streams and stuff more easily that way also. But YouTube Premium for Seattle sports, I think, is the way to go. And the other stations, start doing it, and I'll listen to you. I'm not brand loyal. I was a big 710 or a 950 KJR guy growing up, and I have had friends that work there, and I know people at both stations. I have no problems with either station. So all right. So we're Seahawks fans, probably most of the people listening to this. I know that there's been some folks that have made it over this way because of a clip I posted of me talking about the Seahawks potentially trading for J.J. McCarthy. If you're one of these Vikings fans, or maybe University of Michigan fans, or whoever's made it over here from the J.J. McCarthy content, this is probably not for you. But you can stick around and listen. You can tell me if I get it right, because Michigan folks and Minnesota folks are both represented in this. I want to talk about all of the teams that are left in the playoffs and who I think you should be rooting for as a Seahawks fan. And I have some criteria. I'll tell you the criteria that I used. I made a spreadsheet. I'm not going to share it on the screen because I don't want to make you all hate me even more. Maybe, should I? Nah, I'm not going to share it. I'm trying to talk myself into sharing a spreadsheet. Nobody wants that. So I'm going to tell you the order first, or I'm going to tell you the criteria first, and then we'll go down the order. The order is, are they a Seahawks rival? That's a negative point. Do we want a Seahawks rival to win the Super Bowl? Absolutely not. Are they a divisional opponent? Are they a conference opponent? Those are two separate categories. So a divisional opponent is yes, which means 2 points against them. There's only one of those, luckily. Do they have a storied history? Is this an organization that's got a bunch of Super Bowls and great quarterbacks, and we should not want them to win because they are just stacking up organizational accolades? Did they beat the Seahawks in 2024? Do they have an elite quarterback? These are all things that we're rooting against also. These are all points against. And then points for underdog. Is the team an underdog? Which seems like it would be the very inverse of having a storied history. I don't think it is. I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, because I think you can have not a storied history and just be kind of a generic team we don't care about, or a team that's actually a really good team that we're like, yeah, technically you don't have a storied history, but you're not really an underdog because you're a really great team. I think the Buffalo Bills, for example, I don't think are an underdog, nor do they have what I would call a storied history, or at least not storied in the way that I'm talking about for this. And then there's another element, unfortunately, is has their city incurred a recent tragedy? Which, of course, there are 2 Los Angeles teams playing in the playoffs, and certainly you can have a soft spot in your heart for those teams without liking them that much. In 2001, I remember being like, it would be really beautiful if the Yankees won the World Series this year. And then Luis Gonzalez hit a game-winning single that won it for the Diamondbacks. I was like, okay, well, that's actually probably better for baseball, or for me anyway, the way that I consume baseball. So I guess I'll go. I will go back to front. The least rootable team to the most rootable team, and I'll give you some kind of some information why. Obviously, I think for a lot of people, the Kansas City Chiefs are at the bottom. I think if you're a Seahawks fan, so this is high score is bad, low score is good in this calculation that I've put together, and each one of those categories is only worth 1. And the maximum points a team can score is 6 points, because there's like 6 points against, 2 points for. The Green Bay Packers in last place with 5 points. I do consider them a Seahawks rival. They're not a divisional opponent, but they are a conference opponent. They have one of the most storied histories in all of football. I'm sick of it. Get some new blood in there. They did beat the Seahawks in 2024, and where I think there is some controversy, but it is unimportant to their ranking, because the next team didn't beat them by, or I guess lost to them, beat them by 2 points, is, do they have an elite quarterback? Is Jordan Love an elite quarterback? For the purposes of this count, I gave him a yes. I gave him a yes as an elite quarterback. Could we debate that? Is he an elite quarterback? I don't know. I will say it's an alarming argument for needing an elite quarterback, this list that we're going to go through and who's in the playoffs. So yeah, Green Bay Packers, the least rootable team for Seahawks fans in this postseason. In second place and now I gave them second place, or I guess second to last, least rootable. So second least rootable. I counted them as a Seahawks rival, a former AFC West team that played the Seahawks in the AFC West every year, 2 times a year. They have a storied history, especially their recent history, and they have an elite quarterback. The Kansas City Chiefs are third, have 3 points. I'm messing this up a lot. They have 3 points. They are second least rootable for Seahawks fans. You could argue at this point, like, I don't know if Kansas City would consider the Seahawks a rival. I'm maybe borrowing a little bit of, they might be a 2.5 point team. I don't feel super strongly. I could see the argument of that they are not actually a Seahawks rival, which actually is all the more impressive that Green Bay would then beat them by 3 points. Green Bay would be the least rootable team while doubling their next foe. Okay, the next 6 teams are all tied with 2 points. We'll go through them. Individually. We have rivals of the Seahawks. I gave credit to that to the Rams, the Steelers, the Broncos. Conference opponent, obviously the Eagles, the Commanders, the Vikings, the Rams. Storied history, the Steelers and the Broncos. Now, I'm going to tell you, I could be compelled to say that the Commanders, under a previous name, under Joe Gibbs, deserve to be considered to have a storied history. Their history meant nothing to me as a Seahawks fan, and it might just be because they were good when the Seahawks were bad. Also, I think that any good they had in their history was probably undone to some degree by the constant controversy around their past ownership group and their mascot. So, anyway, did they beat the Seahawks in 2024? The Rams did one game. The Seahawks won the other game, obviously, but they ended up beating the Seahawks for the division, so I feel fine about that. Minnesota Vikings beat the Seahawks. The Bills beat the Seahawks. And then, do they have an elite quarterback? I gave elite quarterback, and this might be controversial. You can tell me which side of this is controversial. I gave elite quarterback to Jalen Hurts of the Eagles. I gave elite quarterback to Josh Allen. I don't think that's going to be controversial. I gave elite quarterback to Jaden Daniels. by the way, there's so many Jaylens and Jadens. I'm like now, yeah, Jaden Daniels, Jesus Christ. Talking into a microphone creates, you mess up in ways that you never thought you would. You like, I'll go back and listen and I'm like, oh, that's not what I meant to say. That's not what I thought I was saying in that moment. That's not what my memory was me saying. Although I do want to acknowledge, by the way, I am wearing a Green Bay NFL draft. The NFL draft is being held at Lambeau Field in April. I was going to try to get out there. Beautiful experience. I talked about it on this podcast. Still, even with that, even with my great time at Lambeau Field, the team I am rooting the least for in these NFL playoffs. So yeah, I did not give elite quarterback to maybe the one controversial one would be not counting Matt Stafford. I could see an argument against that. I didn't give it to Bo Nix either. I did give it to Jaden Daniels. I did not give it to Bo Nix. An argument could be made that Bo Nix had an equally impressive season. I will not be making that argument, nor do I think the upside is the same for Bo Nix. So I didn't count Bo Nix, did count Jaden Daniels, no Sam Darnold, no Russell Wilson, believe it or not. I went back and forth on Jalen Hurts. You can tell me what you think, if he's an elite quarterback or not. I think he's very good. The Eagles have had a lot of success under him. Not enough to be not enough to have a storied history, I would say, by this silly rationale. But underdogs. I gave the Rams because they're at kind of the end of the window. You got late stage Stafford. Obviously, they're going to be because of the fires in Los Angeles. They're going to be. I think they're moving their first round game to Arizona. And also like they get the recent tragedy point, unfortunately. So all those teams have 2 points. There's one team, by the way. There's no tie for first, but there is a 4-way tie for second most rootable. I feel good about rootable, by the way, as an adjective. So, a rival of the Seahawks. We're going to start to see less of these categories filled. I don't know if that's obvious. I gave the Los Angeles Chargers a rivalry with the Seahawks because an old AFC West rivalry. You got to be. I don't know if there's an active rivalry. I don't know if the players feel a rivalry, but I think the fans, for Seahawks fans, especially longtime Seahawks fans, you probably feel some rivalry towards the then San Diego, now Los Angeles Chargers. The conference opponent, the Lions, the Bucks, that's it. The other two teams are that tied for second are AFC teams. Beat the Seahawks in 2024. The Detroit Lions beat the Seahawks in 2024. Underdog. The Lions are an underdog. Even though they're a very good team, it's obviously a team that never won a Super Bowl, has just been a perennial loser. And so even though they are a very good team and they've been good for a couple of years, I'm counting them as an underdog. And then obviously the recent tragedy category. The Chargers get the point in the recent tragedy category, which leaves, by the way, a team who. So these teams all scored 1 point net when you take out the negatives for the negative contributions for underdog for recent tragedy. By the Lions and the Chargers, this other team almost scored a -1 because the Houston Texans are. I would consider them an underdog, an expansion franchise. They're on their how manyth quarterback? They've had somewhat limited franchise success. Second-year quarterback that had, this is where there's controversy. By the way, I gave elite quarterback to Baltimore. Gave it to the Chargers. You can argue with me on the Chargers. Is Justin Herbert an elite quarterback? I can see the argument against it for sure. I could see them deserving to be. I'll tell you, if the guy that I picked for the Texans as an elite quarterback, if CJ Stroud is an elite quarterback, Justin Herbert certainly is. If he's not, you start to get into the argument for Herbert. I think Herbert's probably a little bit better than than Stroud at this point. Not necessarily that I would, on their present contracts, pick them in that order, but I'd probably, if I had to go win one game, I might pick Justin Herbert at this point. Yeah, so I gave elite quarterback to the Ravens and the Chargers, Herbert and Lamar Jackson. So the Houston Texans, underdog is a point taken away. Elite quarterback is a 0.4 for a net 0, and the most rootable team officially for Seahawks fans. There's no conflict with the Houston Texans, and that's who I'm rooting for. That's my number one. I'm probably Detroit Lions number 2, and then I'm pretty ambivalent after that. Do I want to see the Ravens win? I mean, I think it would help validate Seahawks fans' excitement about Mike Macdonald, but I don't really care that much about them. Those are my two teams. Houston, I would like to see a Houston-Detroit Super Bowl. We will not see that, but I would love to see that. All right. Now we're going to talk about these offensive coordinator candidates. And I'm willing to move on from, or at least we could talk about it later at a later time. I'm willing to move on from the idea that I don't think the Seahawks should have fired Ryan Grubb. I like Ryan Grubb. There started to be some kind of rumblings and leaks that he didn't get along with everyone in the front office, and he didn't get along with everyone in the building, and had some philosophical differences with Mike Macdonald. Macdonald and Grubb both are just such low-key, low-energy, not to be like kind of low charisma guys that you don't. It's hard to imagine those guys really butting heads that hard, but presumably they're able to crank up the argument behind closed doors. So I'm willing to move on from the fact that I don't think he should have been fired. He is fired, and the Seahawks need to move on to a new offensive coordinator. I suspect that the next Seahawks offensive coordinator will have a couple traits. There's guys that I like that don't have these traits, but the Seahawks top coaches at this point, their top ranking coaches are all defensive coaches. I think Leslie Frazier is the assistant head coach plus like a consultant. Mike Macdonald, Adam Durde is your coordinator. Like, these are your 3 highest ranking coaches, presumably, and they are all 3 defensive coaches. So there isn't someone out there to supplement or to advise at this time. Theoretically, they could hire some sort of consultant, but there's not somebody out there to supplement play calling, right? There's not like Brian Dable takes over play calling because he's the head coach and an offensive-minded coach. There's not that guy in Seattle. So I think the Seahawks are going to, my guess, I have no inside information, is that they prioritize a couple things. Previous play calling experience will be very valuable, but I think they're going to want someone who has coached at minimum quarterbacks or running backs. Not to say that the offensive line isn't important, but I don't see a lot of offensive line coaches going straight from offensive line coach to offensive coordinator without an offensive-minded head coach who can supplement the fact that offensive line coach maybe has never called plays at any level, including as a player in his career. Do I want an offensive line coach, a former offensive lineman, likely calling, like designing pass plays? Probably not. Am I interested in what that person can do for the run? And do we see a lot of teams that have a run game coordinator and a pass game coordinator, including past Seahawks teams, by the way, including the Tom Cable, Darrell Bevel Seahawks had. Cable was the run game coordinator-ish. I don't know if those were the official titles, but like he was in charge of the run game. Bevel was in charge of the pass game. I also think that they're probably, if it's not someone who has previous play calling experience, I think it'll be someone who played or has coached quarterbacks or running backs. So I'm going to go down the list because they interviewed 2 guys. They interviewed Hank Fraley. And I want to make this completely clear. This is full speculation on my part. This is me saying, I think this, and I think this is upsetting. I think this is gonna be a boring pick because the Seahawks took a big swing with Ryan Grubb. I will acknowledge that. Whatever you feel about him, and I like him a lot, and I wish he would have stayed, bringing in a guy who's never coached in the pros, bringing in a guy who runs these offenses that are very exotic and innovative and progressive, it's a risk. Big risk. A risk that I think didn't have completely negative results, but a risk nonetheless. I think whoever they hire next is going to be someone that Mike Macdonald does not have to worry about. Especially if you believe that the part of the reason why Ryan Grubb got let go is because Mike Macdonald didn't agree with him, because he did have to worry about him, it would seem. So I think it's going to be someone who's got significant coaching experience of quarterbacks, running backs, and ideally has previous play calling experience. So let's talk about the two guys the Seahawks have interviewed or have requested interviews for, and one guy that they've requested an interview for that I don't think they've interviewed. So the guy that's in the news right now is Clint Kubiak, son of Gary Kubiak. I was a huge Gary Kubiak fan. What him and Alex Gibbs did to the running game in the NFL was nothing short of revolutionary. I don't know if Gary Kubiak remained revolutionary. He certainly didn't have elite success in the NFL. And then I think he had a heart condition that stopped him from coaching eventually. Clint Kubiak is obviously his son, someone who's been around presumably the coaching profession for a long time. Called plays in New Orleans this year. Does that mean, do we love that? Do we not love that? I mean, that's not super exciting to me, but he does fit the criteria that I said that I think the Seahawks will go for, that will actually hire. They're going to interview a fair amount of people. I think they're going to do their due diligence, but I think the person they actually hire will be someone that Mike Macdonald doesn't have to worry about, that has called plays or has extensive experience coaching quarterback, running back. Thomas Brown. Oh, so the other guy that the Seahawks interviewed or were rumored to be interviewing is Hank Fraley. He's the Detroit Lions offensive line coach. His entire career, he's been an offensive line or assistant offensive line coach. He's never called plays, from what I can tell. I'm sure he's designed blocking schemes and all that stuff. But again, do you think this guy is going to have the in-depth knowledge of route combinations that you want out of an offensive coordinator without ever having coached anything but offensive line? I have my doubts. I do think, by the way, that the Seahawks are going to commit themselves to running the ball. The other thing that I think they will be very interested in are guys who have coached under one of the Harbaughs at some point. I think that's another point in their favor. If we were making the spreadsheet where you get points for all the positives, I think the positives, to reiterate for the 50,000th time, have called plays, extensive experience coaching multiple skill positions, and a Harbaugh disciple. Those are the three, I think, opportunities for a positive opinion from the Seahawks. So the Seahawks also are interviewed Thomas Brown, who was he came into the season, I think, as the Bears passing game coordinator. In his career, he's been a passing and a running game coordinator. He was the assistant head coach. He became an offensive coordinator when Shane Waldron got fired. Then he became the interim head coach when Matt Eberflus got fired. This is a guy that checks every box. He's also a guy, by the way, just for the record, who is black and would help to satisfy the Rooney Rule stuff, but I think is a legit checks the boxes across every skill that I think the Seahawks will value outside of having not, to my knowledge, coached under a Harbaugh or under a Macdonald. They're in that. I don't think he comes from that coaching tree, but really interesting dude. I know people are going to trash him for his clock management at the end of the season. Whatever. He also played against the Seahawks. That was not a super impressive offensive day for Caleb Williams. I was sweating through my comforter with COVID, presumed COVID at the time, so I didn't watch that game incredibly closely. And waking up, I went to sleep when it was 6-3, and waking up for it to still be 6-3 was pretty shocking and not necessarily promising for anyone interested. And then I have 6 candidates that the Seahawks have not interviewed yet, to my knowledge, and I'll narrow this down to my top I guess I would say my top three. So Shane Day is the quarterback coach with the Chargers, coaching under Jim Harbaugh. Obviously, he actually was a quarterback coach with the Chargers, then got fired and then brought back when Harbaugh came back. Just one little odd fact when I was looking into him, he coached at Auburn Riverside High School. It's like one of his first, or maybe his first, I think it was his first coaching job. Does not seem to have any Northwest ties that I'm aware of, but coached at Auburn Riverside High School in Auburn, Washington. Why? I don't know, but he's lived in the area, presumably. Another guy that I like, Byron Leftwich. I will say Byron Leftwich, so he was an offensive coordinator in Tampa Bay, coached Tom Brady to Super Bowl. He was a head coach candidate after 2021. He was the next guy. And then he got fired after 2022 and has not had a meaningful coaching position since then, but he's a guy that I think is at least interesting. Maybe not a guy that's going to be as focused on running the ball as I think the Seahawks are going to want to be. Arthur Smith is a guy, I will say, I think he's interesting. Certainly a guy that's willing to run the ball. Was an offensive coordinator in Tennessee before he had the Falcons head coaching job. And now he is coaching in Pittsburgh. I mean, these are three organizations with a reputation of being big, physical, road grading teams. The other note I have written down for Arthur Smith, this man is 42 years old. And I'm not telling you that I'm good. I'm 38. I'm not telling you I'm good looking for 38. What I'm telling you is Arthur Smith looks terrible for 42. Go look up a picture of Arthur Smith. Mike Kafka is another guy who he was the offensive coordinator for the Giants. I believe he relinquished play calling duties to Brian Daboll this year. The Seahawks tried to interview him last year. The Giants blocked it. Will they still block it? I mean, it sounds like Brian Daboll is going to stick around, which is crazy, but will they still block it at this point? And I'll tell you, Mike Kafka is the first of my top three guys that I would like to see become the Seahawks offensive coordinator. Unless somehow they would bring Ryan Grubb back. But I think the chances of that are pretty slim. Another guy that I like, that I think would be interesting, especially if the Seahawks move towards drafting or signing a young new quarterback and they find someone that fits a mold, a specific mold. T. Martin is the quarterback coach in Baltimore, and he's gotten a lot of credit for how Lamar Jackson has developed. T. Martin was a quarterback. I think obviously the offense they're running in Baltimore is centered on Lamar Jackson, on maximizing Lamar Jackson's skill set. And in that offense, Lamar Jackson has gone from an elite runner whose running ability made him a very efficient passer to a guy who I think is a very good to elite passer and remains an elite runner, and also a guy who's managed to stay pretty healthy. So I think T. Martin would be really interesting. He obviously, because he's in Baltimore, he comes from the Harbaugh tradition. He's got quarterback coach experience. He was a quarterback. He's very interesting. Matches two of those criteria. So Mike Kafka, T. Martin, those are my 2 and 3. And number 1, and I actually heard this, I think, on sports radio, and I was like, that's a great idea. Because this is a guy that I thought would have been interesting as a Washington Huskies head coaching candidate. A guy that I think, not only would he be interesting as a pro candidate, he's interviewing for some jobs. David Shaw, who took over for Jim Harbaugh at Stanford, coached there for a very long time. To a lot of success, by the way. He coached some very good teams. He was obviously an offensive play caller. He was an offensive coordinator under Harbaugh and then a head coach, and helped see Stanford through some really good years. And then kind of out of nowhere, and it's probably a little bit to a degree, it's like the NIL thing crept up on so many coaches. And if you're a guy that coaches at Stanford, you're the NIL is your worst nightmare. Not because Stanford doesn't have money, but because that's not why people go to Stanford in a lot of cases. And it's also It's difficult to get people into Stanford. It's, yeah. NIL is going to hurt schools like that. NIL is going to hurt these like high-ranking academic institutions that are trying to compete on the national stage athletically. I don't know if that's why he stepped down at Stanford, but certainly a guy that I'd be interested in. I don't know if I have these guys in an actual order. I think David Shaw is the most interesting because he's a guy that I think can come in and just like take over the role. He could take over the role completely. He won't need a bunch of guidance from Mike Macdonald. He's been in college very committed to running the ball. And I think that Mike Macdonald, and there's one other guy that I don't find exciting at all, but I'm going to bring him up because his name is inevitably going to come up that matches this criteria also. A guy that can come in and he's got enough gravitas and experience and confidence to take the job and own it and let Mike Macdonald focus on all the tasks, the other tasks that a head coach has to, and also focus on developing an elite defense. And the other guy, of course, is Doug Peterson. So if David Shaw gets hot, none of those four guys I just mentioned, the last four, David Shaw, Doug Peterson, T. Martin, Mike Kafka, none of those guys are going to inspire a ton of confidence. Kafka, because he coached on a team that was on a bad team, frankly. Kafka coached on a bad team. T. Martin has not called plays to my knowledge. David Shaw has been out of coaching for, I think now this would be his third year if he doesn't coach next year. And Doug Peterson just got let go by the Jacksonville Jaguars, where he had failed to develop Trevor Lawrence and created a team that was like, I think 2 years ago was a playoff contender and crumbled, and this year was not a playoff contender. These are not going to be exciting names, but I think the Seahawks need someone they can depend on to come in and take over the job. And I think that those last two guys, David Shaw and Doug Peterson, are those two guys. I prefer Shaw, and maybe it's because of the unknown, by the way. I think Shaw would be an interesting pro coach. I don't think Peterson's as interesting. Grubb was very interesting. I don't think Peterson's very interesting. Kafka's more interesting than Peterson for sure. And then you go down that list and it's just like it's a boring list, right? And there's also going to be guys, by the way, that we hear about that are quarterback coaches' places and decide that they want to become offensive coordinators. Maybe the Seahawks are a place for that. I don't know, but it'll be interesting. But those are my top three. My top three plus a guy that I think is very likely to be in the mix, being Doug Peterson. So Mike Kafka, T. Martin, David Shaw. All right. Is that a podcast? The one thing the thing that I was going to talk about that we're not going to talk about with the Mariners that I was disconcerted by listening to local sports radio is local sports guys have finally come around on park factors being a thing. This is something I was talking about last year, about how the Mariners don't have an elite rotation. They have a very good rotation. They don't have a historically elite rotation. That was historically good. One of the best rotations in history. Not true. Very good rotation. T-Mobile Park suppresses offense to a prohibitive degree. We'll get into it more on Monday. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Casey McLean Comedy everywhere. Come see me, by the way, if you live up north. I'll be in Oak Harbor at Grand Teton Brewing. Teton, I don't know. And then go to CaseyMcLeanComedy.com. I'm going to try to do a better job of keeping my calendar updated, and follow me at Casey McLean Comedy everywhere. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I love you so much. I don't actually really care about you that much. And happy birthday to my sister who turned pretty old yesterday. All right, bye.